Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, Immanuel Kant, narrated by Charlton Heston. Part 3.
The best way to understand Kant's fundamental ideas is to examine the differences in outlook that divided the rationalist and empiricist philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries. For the rationalists, the source of all knowledge is reason itself. They argue that the essential ingredients in all of our knowledge are discovered not outside of us in nature, but within our rational selves. Rationalists cite mathematics as the best supporting evidence for this view. We gain mathematical knowledge, they claim, by deriving new theorems and equations from those previously known. In geometry, we deduce new theorems from truths already proved. Rationalist philosophers like the French thinker René Descartes argue that all of our knowledge is like this. In his Discourse on Method, Descartes reports,
"The long chains of simple and easy reasonings, by means of which geometers are accustomed to reach conclusions of their most difficult demonstrations, had led me to imagine that all things, to the knowledge of which man is competent, are mutually connected in the same way, and that there is nothing so far removed from us as to be beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it, provided only we abstain from accepting the false for the true, and always preserve in our thoughts the order necessary for the deduction of one truth from another."
Descartes is saying that all truths are necessary truths. If this is so, then our grasp of them depends not on our experience of things in the world, but on our ability to reason logically. The empiricists, by contrast, believe that all of our knowledge, with the possible exception of mathematics, comes from experience. John Locke, the noted English empiricist of the 17th century, asks,
"How comes the mind to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge?"
Locke immediately answers his own question.
I answer in one word: from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observation, employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking. These two are the fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have, or can naturally have, do spring.
Locke, unlike Descartes, is saying that we discover truth not by thinking more clearly, but by directly examining the evidence around us. We then draw the proper conclusions from our observations. For example, we can't possibly know merely by examining the concepts of tree and leaf that oak trees have leaves. The fact that they do have leaves is contingent, not necessary. This fact is apparent when we recall that some trees, like firs, have needles rather than leaves. Till we actually examine some oak trees, we have no way of knowing whether they have leaves, needles, or flowers. The basic difference between rationalists and empiricists is summed up in their views about what sort of thing the mind is. According to the rationalists, the mind contains various innate ideas, a store of implicit hidden knowledge that our thinking slowly brings out. In this view, the human mind conforms to the design of the natural world through what the noted German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz calls a pre-established harmony. In effect, when we learn our own minds, we gain a knowledge of nature as well. The empiricists, however, see the mind as what the English philosopher John Locke calls a blank tablet, a tabula rasa. It possesses no innate ideas, but simply has the capacity to receive impressions from experience. Unless we have experience, our consciousness will remain absolutely void and empty. Kant views this famous philosopher's debate as sterile and wrong-headed. In the introduction to the Critique, he says,
"There can be no doubt that all of our knowledge begins with experience. For how should our faculty of knowledge be awakened into action did not objects affecting our senses partly of themselves produce representations?
This sounds like the voice of a good empiricist. However, Kant immediately adds the following.
But though all of our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. For it may well be that even our empirical knowledge is made up of what we receive through impressions and of what our own faculty of knowledge supplies of itself.
For Kant, the supposed dichotomy between rationalism and empiricism is false. Rationalism and empiricism are both partly right and partly wrong, he says. Rationalists have understood too well reason's contribution to knowledge. Empiricists have understood too well the indispensable role of experience in knowledge. Now, it would be a mistake not to appreciate the successes that sustain the warring camps. Rationalists can point to mathematics, of course, to support their theory of knowledge. They also find important support in physics and astronomy. For example, there's a simple mathematical relationship between the orbital velocity of planets and their distance from the sun. This relationship has always existed, and the human mind has always possessed the power to grasp it. But this knowledge was only discovered by the astronomer Johannes Kepler in the 16th century. Kepler believed that his discovery showed that mathematical reasoning was an almost divine power.
For what is implanted in the mind of man other than numbers and magnitudes? These alone we comprehend correctly, and if piety permits us to say so, this recognition is of the same kind as the divine. Geometry is one and eternal, a reflection out of the mind of God. That mankind shares in it is one of the reasons to call man an image of God.
Kepler's discoveries and similar discoveries by Galileo and Isaac Newton generally support the rationalist view that the fundamental truths of nature lie hidden in the logical and mathematical powers of human reason. Galileo put the point this way.
Philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders in a dark labyrinth.
Empiricist thinkers reply by insisting that many scientific facts hardly seem to be necessary truths, nor does it seem that all facts can be discovered by some sort of mathematical reasoning. When we seek to answer questions like, why are bats blind, or why did the dinosaurs become extinct, math or reason alone don't seem to produce answers. We find that the answers depend on various natural contingencies, conditions, and circumstances that could have been different. These examples seem to support the empiricist's claim that we can learn about nature best by examining directly. We can find out from experience how things happen to be. Kant's philosophical genius is to realize that neither of the cases alone can be totally satisfactory. Neither side can admit that some of the evidence supports the other side without giving up its claim to the truth about knowledge. If each theory is only partly correct, then both must be essentially wrong. Just as a piece of fruit can't be half an apple and half a grapefruit, so the mind can't both contain innate ideas and be a blank tablet. If it appears now one way and then the other way, this can be only because it really is something else entirely. It's something that seems like a blank tablet in certain conditions and seems like it contains innate ideas in other conditions. But these partial appearances reveal nothing about the mind's true nature. This question can be compared to a question about the nature of a table in a dark room. The table's invisible in the dark. Does this mean it will remain invisible when the lights are turned on? Of course not. It's not in the nature of the table to be invisible. It merely seems so in the dark. To see the table's visible qualities, we only have to turn on the lights and thereby create the conditions in which it can be seen. In a sense, Kant's great critique turns on the philosophical light. He shows that underneath the apparent argument between the rationalists and the empiricists lies a basic agreement. In spite of their many differences, the two camps agree about what needs to be explained in any theory of knowledge. Both rationalists and empiricists conceive of knowledge as a kind of relationship between reason and the external world, between the human faculty of knowledge and nature. Knowledge exists when our mental idea of the world corresponds to the way the world really is. Kant believes that both rationalism and empiricism are partly correct, yet both are also guilty of the same concealed error. That error lies in the seemingly common-sense picture of the problem that both sides share. They imagine that the mind and the world, that is, reason and nature, exist separately, side by side. The mind and the world exist in such a way that what's inside the mind, mental concepts, can be compared with what's inside the world, natural objects. Once this dualistic picture is accepted, it's easy to suppose that the problem is finding out under what conditions ideas on one side and objects on the other side correspond. If you set up the picture, it's very easy to see the issue in these terms. Unfortunately, Kant says this picture's an illusion, and what we see in it is false. We're so used to the idea that there's a difference between what goes on inside our own heads and what goes on in the external world that we don't at first catch this illusion in the philosophical picture. In fact, to distinguish between our private thoughts located inside our heads and external things located in nature outside our heads is actually to distinguish between various thoughts and perceptions within our consciousness. We're not aware of anything completely outside our consciousness.
Reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own. And it must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings, but must itself show the way with principles of judgment based upon fixed laws constraining nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining.
Scientific research isn't casual observation where a researcher just sees what happens to turn up. Experiments are carefully designed according to various rational requirements. The scientist is expecting to see certain things and already has a theory to make sense of what he sees. If this doesn't conform to what he expects, of course, he has to go back to the drawing board and reconsider everything. He can't make progress without direct experience, but he also has to have more than direct experience alone. As Kant explains,
reason, holding in one hand its principles, and in the other hand the experiment which it has devised in conformity with these principles, must approach nature in order to be taught by it. It must not, however, do so in the character of a pupil who listens to everything that the teacher chooses to say, but of an appointed judge who compels the witnesses to answer questions which he has himself formulated. Reason must seek in nature whatever has to be learnt, if learnt at all, only from nature. But it must adopt as its guide, in so seeking, that which it has itself put into nature.
Kant says that reason, or the human mind, has two aspects. One of these is the common sense aspect, which Kant calls the empirical. The empirical mind is simply our ordinary, everyday consciousness. It perceives and thinks, feels, and desires. This empirical consciousness is subjective in the sense that it always has a particular individual point of view about everything. My point of view for me, your point of view for you. Empirical consciousness experiences the world as something outside of itself, as an objective world. It distinguishes its own inner thoughts and feelings from this outer external world. The other aspect of reason, or mind, is very different. Kant calls it the transcendental. The transcendental aspect of reason is not something of which we're ordinarily conscious. We can discover it, in fact, only by laborious philosophical reflection, such as Kant himself undertakes in the Critique. He introduces the notion of the transcendental by distinguishing its special point of view.
I entitle transcendental all knowledge which is occupied not so much with objects as with the mode of our knowledge of objects.
Transcendental reflection asks not what do I know, but how do I know it? When we explore the second question, we learn not about ordinary objects like trees, cars, frogs. We learn about how these objects and every other kind of thing enter into our empirical awareness. Earlier, we noted Kant's view that everything we know appears within our consciousness. In essence, transcendental reflection is about the nature of consciousness, about the laws that govern its operations. These laws determine not only the way we think empirically, but also the sorts of things we're able to think about. When Kant writes that reason discovers in nature what it has itself put into nature, he means that we discover, empirically and consciously, only the things that our reason, transcendentally and unconsciously, has made it possible for us to discover. As Kant explains, this view implies a reversal of some basic common-sense beliefs.
The highest legislation of nature must lie in ourselves, that is, in our understanding. We must not seek the universal laws of nature in nature by means of experience, but must seek nature as to its conformity to law in the conditions of the possibility of experience, which lie in our sensibility and understanding.
So Kant uses the word transcendental to refer to the conditions that make experience possible, conditions that are found in the way that humans perceive and think about the world. An example may help explain his difficult, subtle point. A creature with X-ray vision would see human beings as made up mostly of bones and teeth, surrounded by hard-to-see, soft tissues. To him, we would look like living X-ray pictures. This creature's consciousness would be shaped, in part, by very different principles from ours. Accordingly, his empirical experiences would be very different from ours. Meeting someone on the street, he might remark that he has a finely shaped pelvis. That's not anything that we would say. The X-ray creature and ourselves inhabit different worlds, at least so far as visual awareness is concerned. The creature's visual experiences are shaped by his special visual capacity. Things invisible to us, like pelvic bones, are vividly apparent to him. The analogy's inexact, but discovering what Kant calls the transcendental conditions of experience is a lot like the X-ray creature trying to find out how his visual experience is so different from ours. He'd have to discover that his eyes work differently from ours. Therefore, things will always look different to him than they do to us. If our X-ray creature lived in a world where everybody had X-ray vision, he and his friends would no doubt believe that nature is made up mostly of hard things, or at least that hard things are much more important in the larger scheme of the universe than soft things. The X-ray creatures would probably conceive of God as some kind of gigantic, impenetrable stone, the hardest and most real of all things. And all of this because of their unique and peculiar way of perceiving things.
This is the end of Part 3. Please download Part 4 to continue.